New Towns for America then became a key theme in the 1960s. The idea that could be taken from what had been learned from Levittown on the one hand that we've just been looking at, but also related to the ideas that came out of the early experiments of the Garden City movement and particularly Radburn in America. So here is a move of, and perhaps the only move that we've seen in America, of combining the private sector with federal initiatives. The idea behind the New Towns for America was that America would be planned. And so here, possibly one of the most famous ones, Reston, Virginia, is a planned community. In looking at this in abstract, you could begin to argue that this is like a whole series of green belts that are put together. Reston is outside Washington, D.C. on the link through to Dulles Airport, and there was quite clear in people's minds that this interplay between Dulles Airport being on one side of it and Washington, D.C. being on the other side of it was an important factor. So what do we mean by a planned community? Firstly, there's a plan of the developments themselves, a structure to each of the developments, but also there's a landscape plan. So we're going to emphasize much more in this talk the principle of peri-urban development, of edge city is going to begin to emerge, that you could create these new edges that would become popular and different. In terms of the Greenbelt towns, they acted as something of an inspiration to a really movement towards an environmental consciousness, an idea that we had to find some element of sustainability. Now, the sustainability came in the first part, and it's hard to take a mind back to what was going on in the 1960s, but the sustainability was the fact that there was greater scientific knowledge, and I'm going to emphasize this perhaps more in the next case study, that the scientific knowledge was one of landscape, trees, water runoff, and even mobility. So I was able to have fairly first-hand knowledge of this settlement, partly because I knew people who were living in Reston, and was able over a number of occasions to visit Reston, and the principle of looking at the highway in a different manner came from Reston. So I'm going to move slightly to the side of this and talk about commuting for a moment, and I think it will become quite self-evident when I do. But you can see here this idea of a grouping that is in a series of villages. So 18 miles from Washington, D.C. is planned for 70,000 people on 7,000 acres using these planned unit developments. There are 2 town centres, which we will look at the evolution of those, and 7 villages. And all of this is in this green belt atmosphere of the town. So here, this is probably the best way to explain the philosophies of the 1960s and what is beginning to happen. Firstly, to go back to my point about commuting, this you could refer to as a commuter's loop. In other words, they structured the highway with a high occupancy vehicle lane, and people commuted by group buses. So this became very well known in that the bus would come at a particular time, it would loop around this dense cluster, it would pick up particularly the men, but I suppose there might have been a little gender diversity. And as soon as it had picked up, it would go through a special entry gate onto the highway and be able to travel non-stop into the centre of Washington, D.C. I'm not quite sure. I think there was a not as regular one that would take to the airport. So here, this idea of the housing cluster, which was called the planned unit development, became all important. As you're zooming your eyes into this, you notice a number of things. Firstly, it is looking at cost effectiveness. There are not garages, there are probably somewhat unappealing garage courts on the one side, very much a Radburn idea, but for an emerging middle class that had limited ability in the mortgage market. So you're looking for where can we get economies. So the economy is the group parking. The second economy is the row house. You get really considerable savings by building the row house. Not everybody would go into a row house, but this would be one of the most popular ideals. But at the same time, you're looking at, and I may be making this up, but I think an emerging set of aspirations in space. The first is how important the green belt is, but look at the way that it's structured. It's actually a golf course. And this is a strange set of relationships between the flight of a golf ball and the fact that these are public walking routes that are going through it. Because the idea is that you could walk and cycle from your unit to the village centre. And so that set of connections became important, but golf was seen as a way that you could protect land and you could have green belts and you could popularise the sport at the same time. Now look more centrally and you also see the club. So the idea of the swimming pool, the tennis courts, you were going to lead this outdoor, social-oriented life that was truly American. You can see a sort of view of America in this one slide. And again, quite a strong element of prefabrication and mass production could go into this. I'm lingering on this because by looking at it in this way, you can begin to see a possibility of how we might move forward, although I think it becomes a difficult one of how would you organise between movement systems and house building and land availability and affordability, and particularly where I look at this other side of it. So top left, you're looking at another of these planned unit developments, but also it's married with this lesser density, perhaps somewhat closer to a sort of disaggregated Levittown, where everybody has their own expressive home. This, again, can be looked through with two lenses. You could say, well, having economic diversity in the community, having this mix of opportunity, having the opportunity that you could move up, if you wish, from the row house to the individual house, this was seen as part of the American dream. Now, when we look at it now, of course, it looks entirely different with our help of our good friends of Google. On the middle right, we were looking at this circle a few minutes ago, and you can see that this became the beginning of a culture of tree planting in America. And in many cases, these towns that were underwritten by the federal government, so the federal government was giving a huge amount of infrastructure finance into the building of the town, but you had to meet certain criteria. You had to meet criteria in terms of income groups moving into the town and the greening of the town. And you can see this was really quite successful. Now if you look in the bottom left-hand corner, we're going to begin to look at the first of the villages in a moment. So here again, this pattern of cluster and cluster, you go through with playgrounds, walkways that are coming through the woods. You can see the village centre in the background of this, which we'll look at in a moment. And you can see the building method. The building method is really important. You took on a unit at a time. So even though there's some disturbance in this middle area still to be constructed, it was being constructed really rapidly, and to a large extent each of these units could act autonomously around the tennis courts and the pickup van for going to work. So here's an early photograph of the village centre, the marker, the pedestrian walking area, but much more integrated, much more scaled down, with town homes that characterise this. So again, a choice. Elder housing would often go to the village centre, and the idea of water capture. So here, the lake, I think it's Lake Anne, is the centre part of the village. This is the place that you would hang out. Again, we're looking at the time, we're now moving into the 1970s, and award-winning architecture of 1970s America that created something that was really a return to small-town America as the ideal of the future. Now we begin to look at it by drawing back from Reston, which you can see marked here. I put the marker on of where Reston is, and you can begin to anticipate a movement that was beginning to take place as we moved into the 1980s. And this was the movement towards Edge City. The idea that you could create private jurisdictions that were outside the main city, where the counties were weak. You could have special powers, you could create your own road districts, and you could create work at a very different density. So Edge City became one of the main themes that people thought was really progressive, and in a book by Garrow called Edge City, Life on the New Frontier, that was produced in 1992, it saw a balance between, on the one hand, this hinterland that was a garden city of sorts, but next to the highway would become Edge City. Again, a very, very different theme of the idea of city. And you can begin to see why you've got this happening as we begin to introduce Dulles Airport into the scheme, that you can see the attraction excuse me, of Dulles on the one hand, and why we've got Edge City here. And it begins to, as we draw back from this, we can begin to see how this network begins to emerge on the edge of the city. Extremely worrying, worrying from the point of view, of course, this created the mass traffic congestion, the mass rape of the landscape. It was not controlled in the same way that these early ideals were, and gave the idea that you really didn't need city anymore. So we moved from the idea that you commuted in your joint van, where you developed the van club. These vans were, to give you the idea, there were sort of often 12, 15 people in a van, rather like the van that you see currently that will take you from your parked car at an airport at the moment. The idea here is you didn't need the city at all because you could move out the office building and have that closer to the airport and closer to these new towns. So Edge City became the phenomenon, and also recognizing that increasingly there was a change of household and many more people would be happy to live in apartments. So here we all know this cluster that has emerged, which you could say is the late 20th century and is still being built in the 21st century. The private new town, it would bring in a centralized landscape and put festival pieces into this landscape, but the hotels can move out here, office buildings capturing perhaps more affordable office space because they're getting the land at less money. They're not having to hassle with the center part of Washington, D.C., possibly some of the crime rates, although they've diminished rapidly in the center of the city, were a driving force, and they created an environment that is, in my view, really quite questionable. The other, there's several really quite well-known examples. Columbia, Maryland is the second one. But I wanted to concentrate for a moment on Woodlands, Texas, that began in 1972. It came about through a number of reasons. One is, again, the idea that you could, to a large extent, move out of the inner core of Houston that had a range of issues attached to it, still does, where people were looking for a new environment. But here the energy was put in a somewhat different way, because we'd had, and I need to explain this fairly carefully to you, we'd had the book Design with Nature. Design with Nature, which was written by Ian McHarg, an academic at Penn, and Ian McHarg and his firm were the designers of Woodlands. Why this is important is that Design with Nature argued that we had to respect nature first, and that you could develop a scientific sieve map approach towards nature. You can see at this point the diagrams of their very early concepts are extremely crude. But basically, in an area that you effectively could not build in, which is where the Woodlands is, you could if you took remedial action. So the first part that they came through the scientific investigation was to understand flooding and to take preventative measures. Firstly, you clearly weren't going to build where there could be flooding. If you look at the diagram on the right, you would have the floodplain. You would then have a floodplain that could fill out. So this came by anticipating the absorption factor of land. So you're looking for pervious surfaces. What you do, you put a golf course there. So you might lose the golf course for a few days, but you wouldn't lose your home. And so you then began to put the roads on the highland, on the ridges, and the clustered villages around these. So again, neighborhood units, you can see VC for village center. It's not much of a village, but this great ambition for the Woodlands that came out of Design with Nature was to build a town that would have 180,000 living there, and it's been highly successful. It's now moved in a major metro center. It has part of the University of Houston in it. And so this is the way that it matured in the first phase. And you can see very quickly and easily in this diagram, the greens, you even see the fairways of the golf course, these little slithers of yellow, and pools that are coming in, and you can see the river courses, and then you can begin to see the protected areas around the road structure that are coming up in red, and the building scheme in red that is coming out from the village centre. So design with nature is in effect something else. It's something that became known as, the Woodlands became known as Tree City USA, with its 7 villages in this low-lying area, with very good access to the international airport, Houston Intercontinental, very good access on partly toll roads into downtown Houston, and the fact that it had an office centre, the fact that it had a university, you could say that it was a complete pattern of how to build a city. But on the other hand, it doesn't add up to anything that really reads as urban. The more you begin to look into it, the more you begin to see a transformed suburban ideal, a sort of hodgepodge where the private sector could work out very effectively how it could get really quite large and expensive houses, but it had to meet federal standards with regard to affordable homes. So the cluster homes became a key component. You had to come to a level which they were very happy to do, of affordable cluster homes interspersed with very much more upmarket homes. And you can see in this, it's hard to read, but you can see a type of layout where very different sets of builders and developers could work in unison, and it's really the village centre doesn't add up to much. It's really in this area here, so it's dominated largely by landscape. The rule of it was throughout there had to be a pervious strip to every road. So here you've got not just the strip, but the fact that this became the growing strip. So here, this is the principle of how you would look at the Woodlands. This is the second one where houses coming close to watercourses, because, and here it is in flood, but they are protected. And then you come to this village centre. The wharf is a sort of shopping mall, but very small one, and you can see this leads over a catchment basin lake, so the idea of water catchment became all important. So plenty of water is available there, which probably had anticipated where we are now. But look, the bridge is going over to the club, which has a lot of indoor and outdoor courts, and around the cluster housing, and you've got medical centres and so on. And it's very strange type of overall environment. So we were looking down at this first village here, and it grew village by village throughout, and also linking into a metro centre. So firstly, what's the atmosphere of Woodlands? It's very much trails. It's very much the fact that you have to be fit, that you're going out and you're engaged in nature and play, family oriented, faux sculptures, and it built out extremely well. Look at the floodplain in here, look at the density that they've got, and we're now going to zoom down into this metro centre. I think in doing this, you can begin to see again how the market works. In other words, there are pretty strong boulevard roads that are coming in to this, the original idea, and the watercourse coming through here. Here we have a traditional shopping mall, which was the first thing they built, but now we're looking at this. This probably we could see as an introduction to the 21st century, with the idea that you created, in a sense, a false environment on the outer periphery of the city that could have everything that you wished. It has a running trail that's running around this water harvested false lake, which forms a canal, so you can run down this every morning, and you can be in a highly efficient block. So now you're probably very happy to live in an apartment, because you could say, well, I have everything that I want here. I don't need one of these big houses in Woodlands. Or maybe you move at one point in life from the big house into the apartment. I can have a very fine hotel next door that can feed me. I have shops, coffee bars become very important. Offices can become part of this environment. And so here we're seeing a postmodern idea of Edge City. I hope you notice how important the boats are on the canal. Undoubtedly they have festivals gathering, undoubtedly there's piped music. This is Happy Land, and it's raising for me a very big question about who we are and authenticity and what we're trying to say. And it's certainly saying, as we're moving into the 21st century, we are the fitness, outdoor, but highly consumer society, and almost we don't care that there is an environmental issue going on. We're happy here. Look at us. Barnes and Noble, we're intelligent people. We know what we're purchasing, and life is good. And I think here is a photograph where you can see how the big players, they're not, we need to be clear, these are not players that are doing anything but using their skill set in terms of how they see America. They're putting a lot of investment in the public domain. You could argue this is a landscape architect's dream, but it's also a very big question about Edge City. And it begins to introduce also another radical change that you could say is a 21st century change. And that is the idea of the gated community. So here we're seeing this principle that you live in this very separate enclave. So here, in seeing this now largely built out, one that you need to go and look at, but to me is raising this serious question mark, is Woodlands. And this becomes more profound if I now take you north to the Dallas metro region and we look at Las Colinas. The Las Colinas is an entirely private and gated new town near to Dallas-Fort Worth Airport. So here we're seeing an entire new private new town. If we look at this main block produced by Skidmore, Owings and Merrill, this is the scale of saying around an artificial lake, Lake Caroline, that we are a new town, and then you can also live in these enclaves and around a golf course. So here, this taken at a very early stage of the development of it, the idea was that quick access to the airport, you're not entirely detached from the metro region, so you could get to universities, you could get to downtown Dallas, you could get to watch the Cowboys play, but you would be in this environment where you could, if you wish, worked in one of these buildings or hotel in one of these buildings, come into Dallas and never even go into the city, live at this clustered planned unit development over the other side of the highway, or live within this. And I hope you notice this monorail that is moving through it. This was part of their advertising, that a monorail would take you straight into Dallas Fort Worth Airport. So you've got the golf course on the one hand, and on the other hand, here are Mustangs going through the square in front of the SOM building. It is exactly the size of Trafalgar Square in London that it was modelled off. The trees were imported from King Ranch that flanked this, and these Mustangs that needed a jumbo jet to transport them from London tell us something about this relationship of where Texas sees itself. So here again we have the artificial canal. Believe it or not, the left is actually a parking structure with the monorail above that has never worked. So, individuals and corporations made bold attempts to address a new society in the 20th century. How have professionals of planning, architecture, urban design and landscape architecture would you go about defining the key issues facing cities of the 21st century and bringing out a new basis for action? I think we need to realize that this idea of edge city, this privatizing of space, is really extremely worrying, and we're now beginning to find the need to look for alternative structures.